the active involvement of the public. I know that I have benefited from these discussions and firmly believe that our nation has benefited as well. Barbara joins me in wishing you the most memorable anniversary and continued success in years to come. So we gather tonight, almost exactly 30 years later, on the occasion of the beginning of the celebration of our 70th anniversary. As we embark on that occasion and we seek to both continue the legacy of the organization and to grow its work, the kind of work in the cultivation of democracy that President Bush so kindly referred to, we have for this anniversary a motto that we think says a lot in just a few words about the fulfillment of our mission, about our commitment to civility and to democracy in the context of the current global and national moment. And that motto is, democracy demands discourse. So tonight is the first program in this signature series, and it is being made possible, as will other events that you will see, by contributors to the Council's Rising to the Occasion fundraising campaign. I am deeply grateful to all of those here tonight who have already participated in that campaign, and there are quite a number, and otherwise ask those of you who have not to consider doing so. For tonight's event, as you well know, our keynote speaker this evening is the Honorable Michael McFaul, who was Ambassador of the United States to the Russian Federation from 2012 to 2014. Ambassador McFaul is clearly one of the foremost analysts and commentators on Russia and U.S.-Russian relations, including authoring his current work, From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. Beyond all of that, Ambassador McFaul may well be the only American ambassador, at least in modern memory, to become himself personally the subject of diplomatic wrangling at a summit between an American president and the leader of another world power when, at the Helsinki meeting last July, President Putin made the unprecedented, to say the least, demand that an American ambassador be offered up for custodial investigation by Russian criminal authorities. This is clearly a man, as Teddy Roosevelt said, in the arena, maybe in the dangerous part of the arena, and certainly at the center of one of the world's most consequential geopolitical relationships. The ambassador's remarks on our question for tonight, is the bear back in the woods and how should the eagle respond, will be followed by a panel discussion also including Dr. Alina Polyakova of the Nizza School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Lisa Baglione, the Chair of Political Science here at St. Joseph's University. With that, please join me in bringing to the stage Ambassador McFaul.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Craig. Thanks for having me. Great to see so many people here. It's cold outside. I know it's hard to get here. And I love that we have some students in the back. So I'm appreciative that they're here as well. I just have to say one thing about Meacham. My book came out the same week as Meacham. Never have your book come out the same week as John Meacham. I used to run into him on all the TV shows and radio things. It's like, okay, we both made it to the New York Times bestsellers list. I'm proud of that, but his was there a lot longer than mine was. Great guy, and actually to have to follow in his footsteps or Vice President Biden's footsteps. Tall order tonight. I'm going to actually talk about Biden a bit. And I love this format, the fact that I'm going to talk a little bit, not just a little bit, maybe for a while, about my new book. And it's going to kind of establish the historical predicate for the discussion we can have about contemporary things. And I'm going to try to go 30 minutes without mentioning the word Trump. That's hard to do these days. And forgive me if I screw that up, but I'm going to try to do that. And what I want to do is just kind of give you the argument of the book that I think then sets up very nicely a panel discussion about what we should do. So my book's called From Cold War to Hot Peace. It starts in the Cold War. It ends in our current era. I see some gray hair in this room that I don't need to explain to you what the Cold War was. But to our colleagues colleagues that I teach at Stanford in the background, in the back there, I just want to remind you, for those that didn't live through it, that the Cold War was a very serious, scary moment in American history and world history. Two superpowers with two different ideologies that at times felt like we were going to blow up not just our two countries, but the planet. Most certainly for me as a kid in Montana, surprisingly, I was worried about it, and when I showed up at Stanford as a 17-year-old freshman, my first time in California, I was so worried about it that I signed up for first-year Russian and Poli-Sci 35, How Nations Deal with Each Other, because I thought that if I didn't help to do something about it, we might blow up the world. And as a kid in Montana, I had a pretty simple theory. I had this idea that if we could just get to know these Soviets, right, that's what we called them back then, we might be able to reduce tensions between our two countries. And that was kind of a working hypothesis I had as a kid for the first 2 years at Stanford. Most Stanford kids, they go abroad. They go to places like Paris or London or Florence. Florence is very popular for Stanford undergraduates. I decided that at the end of my sophomore year that I was going to go instead to what then Ronald Reagan called the evil empire. There I am, on my way. By the way, this is, I'm at the Bozeman International Airport here. International only because I think we flew to Calgary at the time. My mother was horrified that her son was going off to the evil empire, right? I'd never been abroad. She was horrified I went to California, by the way. She thought California was a communist country back then. And so, you know, for her son 2 years later to go to the Soviet Union was a pretty shocking thing, but bless her heart, she supported me ever since. I remind you of that time. Some lived it, some I want you to know that history, because for me, because I was engaged in that, the end of the Cold War was a glorious event. It was a fantastic event. You know, ended in many ways the conflict that defined the 20th century. These two gentlemen were part of it. That's Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. But on this day, I think it's very appropriate to remember President Bush, who also played a pivotal role in ending the Cold War. I actually met President Bush as Vice President Bush in Moscow in 1985. It was at that evening, he was there for a funeral, and it was at that evening, listening to him and George Shultz, then the Secretary of State, when I decided that I was going to try to be involved in this, thinking that this could be, and I write about this moment, meeting those two gentlemen at the American Embassy. But these two guys had something to do with it. I want to remind you, these hundreds of thousands of people also had something to do with it. It wasn't just those two guys at the top. And if you look really, really hard, you can see me. I'm there. And believe me, Vladimir Putin knew that I was there. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But just remember how awesome it was at that time. It felt, it was the end of history. That's what Frank Fukuyama wrote, my colleague. It felt like the Russians were joining the West, joining the democratic world, and conflict, you know, we thought was going to go away. And for a while there, it felt like there we go, that these were our partners, right? They were no longer our enemies. So fast forward to today, and it depends on who you ask, but I think most people, I'm not going to assume everybody in this room, but most people think we are at a really confrontational time with the Russians, right? Dmitry Medvedev, the prime minister, compared it to 1962. That's the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Our president, of course, on Twitter, said it was worse than the Cold War. And, you know, we can debate whether it's better or worse. You know, I use this phrase, hot peace, deliberately to echo the Cold War, but to not say it's exactly the same. But whether it's better for worse, you know, I'm not so sure. Just I won't go through this whole list. Maybe we'll do that in discussion. But some good news, bad news. So the good news, that the quantitative nuclear arms race from the Cold War is over. We're going in smaller numbers. The bad news is we have a qualitative arms race on both the offensive and defensive side. Better off, worse off? I'm not so sure. Second thing, good news is that the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, or communism and freedom, is over. That ended with the end of the Cold War. Well, actually, they're still fighting in a few places. Over at Berkeley, they're still, arguing about it. I don't know how on this university campus. I'm a Stanford guy. We don't like Berkeley. Sorry for the cutesy argument. Cutesy shout out to my friends across the bay. But in most places in the country and the world, we're not debating communism versus capitalism. But in the Putin era, he thinks he's battling and fighting an ideological struggle. He defines it in his terms as a conservative, anti-multilateralism, anti-liberal set of ideas that he's been championing against the West. He's been doing this for about a decade, but in the last several years, he's starting to win allies in Hungary, in Italy, and even in parts of our country. So better or worse, because this fight now is not between countries, it's actually within countries. And then finally, the means of fighting the hot peace is radically different than the Cold War. The Cold War wasn't cold. Millions of people died in peripheral proxy wars between communism and capitalism. Let's remember that. But some aspects of our current conflict, I think, in terms of the means being fought, is unique and dangerous. Annexation. We thought we got rid of annexation in World War II. We fought that war in part to rid the world of annexation. Now it's back after Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. Sanctions. There are now more Russians on our sanctions list than at any time in our 200-year history with that country. And there are more Americans on the sanction list than at any time Americans on the Russia list, and I know I'm one of them. I can't travel to Russia today. That's rather unique in history. I'm on a good list, by the way. You mentioned lists. The only other former ambassador to be banned from Moscow was a guy named George Kennan. So that's a pretty good list to be on. But that's strange. We never had that. And some kinds of violations of sovereignty, like what the Russians did in the 2016 election, that also was unprecedented. Assassinating people using chemical and biological weapons in NATO countries, as what happened in Salisbury last year, that's also unique. So better or worse off, it's debatable. But I think we would all agree it's definitely not where we thought we were going to be at the end of the Cold War. And so what I want to do now for the next 15 minutes is just explain what the hell happened, right? And if you don't remember anything else I say in this talk, just remember these two photos, and I'm going to explain what happened between them, okay? By the way, I was at the meeting on the right. That's in Los Cabos, Mexico, at a G20 meeting between the two presidents, and the meeting was a lot worse than the photo, okay? All right, so I'm just going to march you through, and this is kind of the argument of the book. I'm going to bounce around from political science professor to ambassador to kind of try to give you an explanation for what happened. Where did we go off the rails? So the first explanation is about power, nature of international politics. And this argument says that, there we go, that's working, good. For those of you looking, we're going to race through 1,000 years of European history. Don't worry, we're not going to race through it all, and I'm not going to try to explain it all. But what's happening here? What's happening is some countries are rising in power, some of their neighbors are becoming weak, and when those happen on the border, the borders change, and there's a shift in the balance of power between the countries in Europe, and I could show you maps of other parts of the world as well. And so if you accept this, by the way, it takes several hundred years before Crimea becomes part of Russia, but let's leave that for questions. So if you accept this theory of international politics, that power is all that matters, those that advance this argument, they just say, well, what's new? Like, look, Russia was weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia now has new power capabilities. Nothing's new. It's been that way for hundreds, some would say thousands of years. Russia's just acting like a rising power the way they have throughout history. And part of that explanation is true. I want to be clear about it. Power does matter, right? Just to take an extreme example, and let me be careful here. Anybody from Moldova? Good, okay, I shouldn't say that. I love Moldova, but I don't mean to offend Moldova. But you're not interested in me talking about U.S.-Moldovan relations. And we're not worried about Moldova invading Europe or attacking us in either virtually or in a military way, because Moldova doesn't have the capacity to do that, right? You mentioned Vice President Biden. I actually went to Moldova with Vice President Biden. We had a fantastic trip. 50,000 people came out on the streets to see the Vice President. I'm not sure 50,000 people have ever come out to see him before. We joked about them, but we had a great time there, but we're not worried about them because of power, right? So power matters. Russia has capacities to do things like annexation, attack us, support horrible dictators like Assad in a way that Moldova doesn't. But I don't think power's enough for two reasons in terms of an explanation. One, I can think of some countries that have risen dramatically in terms of their power capabilities that aren't threatening us or our allies. Think of Japan, think of Germany after World War II. Even Poland is way more powerful today than they were 30 years ago, and yet I'm not worried about them attacking the United States of America. And if we have time, even China, I don't think we're destined to have a war with China. I think other things have to happen to make that conflict come true, and I think it should be and can be avoided. But the second one is the one I want to focus on, because it's the one that we were consumed with when I was ambassador in 2012, 2013, 2014. When I arrived and was briefed on Putin's top foreign policy interests at the time, on the top of the list was creating something you've probably never heard of. It's called the Eurasian Economic Union. And it's his idea to bring together the former states that emerged independently after the collapse of the Soviet Union, bring them into an economic union to kind of offset the European Union. And when I arrived at the time, he had Belarus and Kazakhstan in, but he wanted Ukraine to join. It was vital to make this thing work to get Ukraine to join. And here's why, and I apologize. This will be my last. I'm a professor. I'm used to asking questions, right? And thank you all, by the way. I'm not competing with your cell phones right now and laptops like I usually have to do when I'm lecturing at Stanford. So I appreciate that. I'm going to tell my students back at Stanford how polite people are here. All right, here's the question. Listen closely. It's a very precise question. Who here has purchased something made in Russia, but you bought it here in the United States? What'd you buy, ma'am? Wow! I have been talking about this book for a while. Nobody's ever said that to me. I'm going to check you. I'm going to check your label after I'm done talking, okay? All right. Thank you for the detail. You didn't buy it off the shelf somewhere downtown. You have a special, okay. That now explains it. My guess is at your shopping centers here, there's not a lot of coats made in Russia. Okay, well, that's a unique answer. I've never heard that answer before. Okay, anybody else? What'd you buy? Wow, this is a wild crowd. Russian chocolate and kvass. Where'd you buy that? All right, okay. So that's special. That's special. I gave this talk in Montana. Nobody raised their hand saying they bought Russian kvass in Montana. All right, well, that's something Russians do. Kvass, chocolate, I don't know if it, you tell me if it was good or not. But kvass, that's something unique Russians make. Anybody else? Any other ones? Sir? Vacuum tubes. Okay, all right. That I've heard before. I live in the Silicon Valley, so there are certain things that they do better than us in that domain. Okay, that's fair. All right, last one, yeah.
You can buy Russian standard vodka.
That's right, you can. There's a lot better vodkas than Russian standard, by the way, but all right. But this is an interesting crowd, okay? Let me say diplomatically. So you've bought some exotic things. Most Americans have never bought anything made in Russia, okay? Just so you know, you're unique. And most people here in the room didn't raise their hand, by the way. And that's because Russians don't export many things that Americans or Europeans want to buy. But before 2014, there was one country where millions of people bought goods made in Russia. That was Ukraine. They don't anymore. And that's why Ukraine was so important to be part of this Eurasian Economic Union, right? And that was Putin's focus, to get them to join. And then in 2014, he changes his plan. He annexes Crimea, invades eastern Ukraine, guaranteeing forever that Ukraine, in my opinion, will never join his Eurasian Economic Union. So that suggests there's something more proximate that happened here, right? It wasn't just about power. He changed his foreign policy dramatically in 2014. So we got to add more to the story. All right, two more things I want to add to the story. Second explanation, it's all our fault. If you're from America, it's all our fault. We did this. We were the ones that brought on this confrontation. And this is an explanation actually popular in Berkeley as well, very popular in Moscow, but also, you know, in other places in Europe and where people look at our imperial ways and blaming us. So I won't go through this in detail, but just to remind you, here's the basic story that if Putin were here, he would tell you. We took advantage of Russia when Russia was weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We went over there, and I was one of these people, and we lectured them about democracy and markets. And then later, when they were weak, we expanded NATO. We then bombed Serbia. We invaded Iraq. We then supported color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. And Putin just said, okay, I've had enough. We are pushing back on all this American confrontational behavior, especially in our backyard, and especially inside our country. And again, part of this is part of the explanation. But all these things happen, and it's part of the explanation. After every one of these events, U.S.-Russian relations did become more troubling, right? And that happened. And I write about all of these in detail in my book. But after all this drama, there was a period of cooperation. We called it the reset. And that's when I joined the government. First in the transition, fall of 2008, and then January 2009. That's my 5th day on the job. No. Yeah, that's my 5th day on the job, and that's his 6th day on the job. Just so you know, he's about to call Dmitry Medvedev for the first time as president to do this kind of laydown of the reset. By the way, it was a transitional time, just a little anecdote. So there are a lot of Bush people still working with us. And one of them grabbed me and said, hey, you know, I know he wanted to say that, he didn't say this. Hey, you know, noodlehead professor from California, he didn't say that. He said, hey, Mr. McFaul, you're not supposed to touch the desk. I don't know if that's true, but if you're in to brief the president, don't touch the desk, okay? But the point I want to make here is at this time, as we were, you know, talking to the president first in transition, and then as we developed our strategy towards Russia, he had this concept that we're not going to cooperate on everything with the Russians, but in certain domains and certain dimensions, our interests might overlap. And if we focus on that, we can achieve what he called win-win outcomes. And as a predicate, you know, as a condition to doing that, we had to forget about some of this historical long-term conflicts that I just talked about. That was his theory of the case, as he would say. And for a while, I just want to remind you, and I'll go quickly over this because it is in the book, and I do want you to buy the book, so I don't want to give you everything. And I want you to buy your sons and daughters the book. And you know, holidays are coming, right? Don't forget. Anyway, you know, for a while, we got some things done. We got some things done that I think were in America's national interest. So this was a great day. This is Prague 2010, the signing of the New START Treaty, where we got rid of 30% of the nuclear weapons in our 2 arsenals. That's a pretty good day's work, right? And let me just say, parenthetically, some people have worked in the government here. Maybe our students in the back haven't yet. It's really hard to do anything in the government. It's, most days you get up, you see the same problems, you kind of go to bed, you come back to work, and it's still there. You haven't done anything. I used to sit across the hall from the folks that were in charge of the Middle East peace process. And, kind of imagine what their days and weeks and months and years looked like. It's pretty hard to get anything done in the U.S. government. Maybe it's hard to get things done in other governments. This was a big thing that we got done that year. It was great. That was a great day. And then we got it through the U.S. Senate, by the way, which is almost impossible to do. It's one thing to negotiate with the Russians, then you got to go negotiate with the U.S. Senate. But that was a great day. We got 72 votes, and that was the day we ratified the treaty. A couple of other things, just to remind you. We developed something called NDN, the Northern Distribution Network, which was a supply routes, different kinds of planes and trains and automobiles going through Central Asia, going through Russia to supply our troops in Afghanistan. When I showed up at the White House, about 2% of our supplies went through that northern route. 95% went through Pakistan. And we had an idea that we were going to take the fight against terrorists into Pakistan. And we were worried that if we did that and we violated the sovereignty of Pakistan, they might cut off our supplies. And in fact, they did that from time to time because we violated their sovereignty from time to time. But over the course of the first 3 years of the reset, we got the northern route up to over 50% of our supplies went through Russia. And, pretty dramatically, at the peak of this cooperation, we had American soldiers flying through Russian airspace. That hadn't happened since World War II. Oh, and by the way, it proved to be incredibly valuable to us one night in 2011 because we did go into Pakistan and we killed Osama bin Laden, and we could not have done that without NDN. Iran. We got the most comprehensive multilateral sanctions against Iran ever. That was the predicate for getting the Iran nuclear deal, which I think was a great deal, and we should have kept with it. Couldn't have done that without the Russians. And then this last box, at least when I teach at Stanford, maybe I don't need to remind you all, but actually we have students here. Nobody ever writes books about non-events, right? And yet when I was in the government, it was really striking to me how we came really close to some crises that then didn't happen. And for me, the scariest one by far was Kyrgyzstan in 2010. The government was overthrown. He was a horrible guy, by the way. He probably deserved to be overthrown. But 100 people died. They did not deserve to die. There was ethnic conflict there between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz. 300,000 ethnic Uzbeks left. And at the time, we thought we were going to witness a genocidal war within Kyrgyzstan and maybe a war between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And it was my job to help reduce tensions. I was scared to death. It was the hardest assignment I had at the White House. And you may think, well, why do I care? Why do you care about Kyrgyzstan? Well, back then, our most important staging base for the war in Afghanistan was in Kyrgyzstan, Manas Air Base. So it was 95% of our troops flew into Kyrgyzstan before they went to Afghanistan. So it was a vital national security asset for our national security strategy. But you didn't read about it. Nobody wrote a book about it because it didn't happen. We diffused that crisis, and we diffused it because we were cooperating with President Medvedev at the time. All right, I'll go quicker through some of these. This slide represents thousands of hours of my life, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details. Every one of those boxes was really hard to get done, but it's just a reminder that during this period, even on the economic story, we were doing a lot of cooperative things with the Russians. And then during this period, I want to remind you, this is just 6 or 7 years ago, by the way. This is not ancient history. Most Russians had a positive view of the United States, and most Americans back then had a positive view of Russia. Just a few years ago. And all of that happened after NATO expansion, happened after the Iraq War, happened after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. So you can't cite these events to explain our current conflict because after these events was this period of cooperation. Well, you can do that, but you get a C- in my class, okay? That's a really bad causal argument. There has to be something else that happened that ended the reset, because these things were already part of history when the reset was happening. And that gets me to the last thing I'm going to talk about and end with, which I think is the real driver of our current era of confrontation, and that's Russian domestic politics. And here, just let me mention two. There's many, and again, I write about it in the book in more detail. Let me just, for tonight, focus on two big things that happened that I think were the real drivers here. One was the switch from Medvedev to Putin. In the fall of 2011, Putin, if you can see him here, loudly announces that he's going to run for president again in the spring of 2012, and that President Medvedev is going to serve as prime minister. And, you know, at the time, I want to be honest with you, in the government, I don't know what outside analysts were saying, but at the time, our assessment, you know, the intelligence community at the NSC, where I was working at the time, was, you know, no big deal. Putin's the big dog. Putin's been making all the decisions. Why should this change anything? He's just moving down the street, right? He's just going to get a new office, going to go back to the Kremlin. And I remember I was in to see the president about something else related to a different topic. And as everybody exited, he grabbed the back of my arm and he pulled me in and he said, Mike, you know, what do you think? What is this going to mean for us? And I said, well, Mr. President, you know, you've gotten to know Medvedev pretty well. They had a pretty good working relationship. He didn't know Putin as well, but he said, I gave him the party line. And he looked at me and he said, come on, man. He said, you don't really believe that. And I said, no, you're right. I don't really believe that, because already we had seen these guys up close and personal enough to know that they had a different worldview. And over the course of the next 2 years, 3 and 4 years, even after my time in government, we got to see that up close and personal. Medvedev thought there's win-win outcomes with the United States. New START treaty, that's good for Russia, good for the United States. Putin's a zero-sum guy. If it's +2 for America, it is -2 for Russia. Second thing, we are a competitor on a good day, and we are the enemy on most days for Vladimir Putin. Remember, he was trained in the KGB. He was trained in the Cold War. We were the ones that destroyed the Soviet Union, in his view. We're part of it. But then this third one is the really important one. Putin has a theory about American foreign policy. He believes that the United States uses force, covert and overt force, to overthrow regimes that we don't like. And guess what? There's some empirical evidence to support that hypothesis. Thank you, sir. There is. In fact, you know, we actually sat down and debated it with Putin one day. First time that President Obama met him. We're out at his house, his dacha. Just a couple of footnotes, because you mentioned Helsinki, Craig. This is our first big summit, like Trump's big summit with Putin in Helsinki. Just a couple of things that are a little different. One, you'll notice we have some advisors at the meeting. National security advisors there, former ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns is there, I'm there. That's a good thing when you're meeting with Putin, to take some experts with you. The other thing you'll notice, we had a note taker. If you can look closely, you can see I have a pad and a pen. I'm the note taker. That's a good thing. I hope they do that the next time they have a summit with Putin. Anyway, sorry for the sidebar there. Oh, and I just blew it. I just mentioned Trump. I apologize. Let me tell you about this meeting, though. It was fascinating, because Putin came loaded for bear. He was ready to school the new guy about all the mistakes that the Bush administration had made in the world. Never President Bush, by the way. He has a soft spot for George W. Bush, but it was the deep state. It was Cheney. It was the Pentagon. It was the CIA. And he went through in detail. He's a detailed-oriented guy, to talk about all the huge mistakes that we had made in the world over the last 8 years. And he got to Iraq, and he went on, you know, you idiots, you blew it up, you don't understand the Middle East, you made a mess of everything. And my guy, my boss, your president, our president, he said, you're right. I agree with you. Kind of looks at him like, what do you mean? Like, I'm playing the Russians in this game, right? You're the Americans. What do you mean I'm right? And he said, well, you know, you probably don't remember, but I just realized I'm mic'd. I can move around a little bit. Can you still hear me? Okay, good. Then I can get in front here. He said, well, you may not remember, but long before it was popular, I was against that war. That's part of the reason I was elected President of the United States. And Putin looked at him, and he was kind of puzzled, but then he thought, well, maybe this guy's different, right? Maybe he won't be like the rest of them. And as we walked out to the cars, I could tell he was kind of seizing up Obama. And as we rode back into town, Obama's like, well, maybe we can work with this guy. Maybe there's some win-win space. But fast forward to 18 months later, the Arab Spring happened. First Egypt, then Libya, then Syria. And I want to be clear, we were reacting to these events. We were not fomenting revolution in any of these places. But for Putin, that was not his theory. It's like, Obama, he's just like Bush. Look at, he's going in, overthrowing regimes he doesn't like. And in particular, Libya became, I think, the beginning of the end of cooperation with Russia. Because that's when we decided we were going to use force to stop genocide in Benghazi. But we weren't going to do it unless the Russians went along with us. Obama's a multilateralist, right? He wanted a UN Security Council resolution. And that's another trip. The same trip we were in Moldova, I actually traveled with the vice president to Moscow. And in Moscow, in this meeting, Medvedev said to Vice President Biden, he said, you guys are right about the Middle East. These dictators have held on too long, and I'm going to abstain on those Security Council resolutions. That had never happened before in U.S. Soviet or U.S. Russian history, where Russia was going along with the use of force inside a country. 2 days after that vote, however, Putin went public in his criticism of Medvedev, and he said he made a huge mistake. He said, Medvedev doesn't understand these Americans. He called our intervention a crusade, going back to the 15th century or 12th century, that we are coming back just as we always do. And I think that's when Putin decided, Medvedev's been drinking way too much of this reset Kool-Aid, I've got to come back. And then, second thing that happened in Russia, at the end of the same year, I want to make clear, this is all the same year, massive demonstrations in Russia itself. Falsified parliamentary vote, no big deal. We thought it was kind of a normal Russian election, 5-6%. What's the big deal? It's Russia. That's how their elections usually roll. But this time, there were smartphones and Twitter and Facebook and VKontakte and a merging middle class. That's who these people are. And they were like, no, you're not going to steal our election. And first 500, then 5,000. And upwards of 200,000 people came onto the streets of Moscow to say, first, don't steal our vote, but by the end, you get 200,000 people together, they get all worked up. By the end of these demonstrations, they were saying, we want a Russia without Putin. We want a regime change. That's what they were saying. And remember, the last time that had happened in Russia, I already told you about, 20 years earlier. That's the last time that you had that many people demonstrating, and that is the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. So Putin, first he was pissed. He was like, I was at some meeting with him, it's like, how can you guys turn on me? I made you rich. What do you turn, how can you turn on me? But second, he was scared. He was worried, remember it's the year of the Arab Spring, that the same might happen to him. And that's when he needed a new argument to mobilize his supporters and to marginalize those demonstrators. And that's when we come into the story. That's when he started to blame us, Obama, America, and me, for starting to foment and support those people. Remember I told you about his theory about regime change. Now he's saying we are doing it inside his country, and we are the ones that are supporting these protesters. And that's right when I arrived as the U.S. ambassador, okay? Right in all that maelstrom, as all these demonstrators are happening, I arrive, and for the Russian government, I know a lot of these people, they're like, Mike, you were like manna from heaven, man, because of my background and that I knew these opposition people. And they would always say, don't take it personally, but we're going to make you the poster child of this argument about Obama and the United States trying to overthrow our government. And when I say poster child, I mean literally poster child, okay? This is a calendar they put out with my face on it. Right as I arrived as ambassador, all the other months of the year are opposition leaders. Here's a couple of other posters just to give you a flavor for the times. The one on the left says, the political circus is again coming to the arena. This is on the eve of a big demonstration on May 6, 2012. And if you can't see me, I'm there listed as the artistic director surrounded by all the opposition figures. The one on the right is, you've heard a lot about fake news and disinformation and deep fakes. Well, that's some photoshopping of me campaigning for Alexei Navalny, the leader of the opposition who was running for mayor at the time. That's not me, just to be clear. That is my head on somebody else's body. And then here, just to give you a flavor, this is like nightly news in a fairly regular way when I was ambassador.
Паника. Увольняют посла США в России Майкла Макфола. Информированные источники из внешнеполитического ведомства сообщили прессе, что последним мероприятием посла, скорее всего, станет День 80-летия установления дипломатических отношений России и США, 16 ноября. Назначение Макфола в 2011 году стало настоящим праздником для российских.
What he's saying here is it was a holiday that I was named ambassador for the revolutionaries because I'm an expert on revolutions. I didn't have a plane like that, by the way. These are now the revolutionaries coming to get their instructions from me. Oh, and by the way, the fascists were also part of the project that I was coordinating. All right, so you get the idea, right? This was my life. I was a lot younger, yeah. Yes, I was a lot. So were you, by the way. All right, can you turn the sound off for me?
Именно стоял за протестами, не нужно было быть пятипядей во лбу. Майкл Макфол, судя по всему, не желал выполнять вводные и сходить со своего курса, провальность которого была очевидна.
Thank you, sir. I want to, you can keep looking at it for a minute, but I want to brace you because the next slide, I actually don't want you to laugh at, okay? And I'm not going to play the video, but this was another video that they put out about me 3 weeks after I showed up in Moscow. And it's a 4-minute video, kind of playful, but then it ends with this. So what do you do with that, by the way? Like, how do you counter that? You get on Twitter and you like argue, I'm not a pedophile. That seemed like kind of a stupid thing to do. It was originally put up on YouTube, and I have some very senior friends at Google, so we got them to take it down. It was very noble of them. But a few days later, it appeared on Russian websites, and to this day, if you use Russian search engine, Yandex, to search my name and pedophile, you'll get 3 million results. So you can't have a reset when this is how your interlocutors are engaging with you, right? It takes two to tango. And Putin's paranoia would not allow us to do any of those more cooperative things. And just to be clear, it wasn't just about me, it was about us, and it was about Barack Obama. This is just one more episode. This is, for those of you who watch Russian news, this is Channel 1, it's Kiselov's show, their kind of 60-minute show. And the argument here is, he says, at first glance, you wouldn't think that Barack Obama has anything to do with ISIS. But if you look closer, it turns out that Barack Hussein Obama and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi actually have the same worldview. And he spent an hour explaining how they have the same worldview. So that's it, right? You can't go forward with that. The final straw, and I'll end on this, was another big demonstration. Notice the pattern, right? This time it's Ukraine. Again, we had nothing to do with the initial explosion. These were people that wanted to join the EU. Their president, Yanukovych, didn't sign up for it. They protested it. There was tragedy. Over 100 people were killed. We were trying to negotiate a deal between the opposition and the government at the time with our European allies. And on February 21st, we thought we had a deal. We thought we had dodged a bullet. 10 hours later, however, Yanukovych showed up in Russia. To this day, I don't quite understand why he left so quickly. But Putin had an explanation for his people. He said, here it is. Here are the Americans. Here's the CIA. They overthrew another regime, only this time this regime is his ally and it's right on his border. And that's when I think he decided to strike back and annex Crimea. And when that turned out to be rather easy, tragically, went into eastern Ukraine. And then 2 years later, decided to go on the offensive against us in terms of what he did in our election. So I'll end with this. Good news, bad news. We'll have time to go over this, I'm sure, in our panel. But here's the good news, bad news. The good news, if you accept my argument, is that we are not destined because of culture or history or the balance of power in the international system to be in conflict with Russia forever. My story is one about individuals making concrete decisions and concrete moments, and different leaders made different decisions. Gorbachev and Putin made very different decisions, and so it's an actor-centric story, right? It's not a structurally determined story. So that should give hope for the future, that we're not destined to be in conflict because of these more structural things. The bad news is that Putin was just re-elected this year to a 6-year term. He could probably re-up if he wants to after that, if he changes the Constitution. And the guy works out 3 hours a day. To the best of our knowledge, he's in great physical health. And I don't think this dynamic is going to change at all as long as Putin is in power. And so I think it's pretty clear what the strategy should be. I end the book by talking about that tragically we have to go back to containing and deterring Russia, cooperating with we can, but most of that. The big wild card, and maybe this is a good segue for our panel, is does a lot of people in the Trump administration agree with me on this? I know lots of people at very senior and lower levels. There's just one guy, the guy on the right. See, it took me a while to get to Trump. He just actually disagrees about that strategy. And that's why I don't know exactly how this story will end in the short run. But if you want to do a deeper dive, of course, you know what you got to do. You got to get the book. So thank you all. Thank you.
Great. Please, Alina, Lisa, come up. Thank you for those remarks, Ambassador. I want to note to everybody, if you haven't noticed, that there are note cards, index cards, and pencils at your seats. If you want to address a question to the panelists, please jot them down, and staff will be around in about 15 minutes to pick up those questions as we're having our conversation, and then we will get to many of them. So let me start by asking our two other panelists to react to that conflict with Russia is not structurally or historically determined, but is primarily an artifact of the personality and psychodynamics, if you will, of Vladimir Putin as an individual. Please.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see the ambassador give this. Is it out? Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, I'll just use this mic. Well, it's really just wonderful to see Ambassador McFaul give this talk. I've seen him give a version of it a couple of times. It changes a little bit every time. I do encourage you to get the book, which I am going to assign in my class at SAIS on Russia and the West. It's a really fascinating read of diplomatic history. But just to go back to your question, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think there's a structural conflict that's necessary between Russia and the West and Russia and the United States. But having said that, I think it's not just about Putin anymore. You know, Putin has created a certain system of governance that is very much based on patrimonialism and kleptocracy, and the system has almost trapped Putin himself. So it's not even clear to for me to see a path forward, because there's going to be a Russia after Putin. But I'm becoming less and less confident that Russia after Putin will look very different. So I think we're facing the reality of the system itself will outlive the man who created it. And what we'll see is sort of a Putinism without Putin whenever Putin probably dies, because he will never, I don't see him ever voluntarily leaving power at this point, because he can't. You can't have the kind of guarantee that he was perhaps able to give Yeltsin when he took over, that him and his close family, quote unquote, would not be harassed or assets not taken away or killed or something worse. So I think that's what, that would be my sort of more nuanced interpretation of that thesis.
Yes, let me see. Does mine work? Okay.
Can we hear? Okay.
So I would also agree, and I think I lean more toward Alina's version, that the domestic political situation exerts a lot of pressure on Putin too. That his formula for rule in the 2000s was very much based on providing economic benefits for many people in Russia, and with that, the problems in the economy thereafter, he was looking for new ways to maintain his legitimacy, and certainly the role or the move toward nationalism and towards finding enemies in the U.S. and elsewhere has been really important. But he's also been helping to generate right-wing activities and anti-American activities all throughout Europe. So yes.
So, Mr. Ambassador, let me just play devil's advocate a little bit and push back on the structural argument. So, let's call this the Stephen Kotkin theory, that Russia has been
him many times. So yes,
yes,
I know
exactly.
the thesis.
You know the thesis. Okay, for our audience,
Yes.
Briefly, that Russia's been an expansionist power for 500 years.
Yep.
And this is just historical continuity, number one. Number two, that there's a fundamental mismatch of interests that has nothing to do with personalities, and that our fundamental foreign policy objective is to prevent regional hegemons, and his fundamental objective is to be the regional hegemon.
Right.
And therefore conflict is built into the structure.
Right. Well, first of all, let me just say I agree, and maybe we should dig into the details of Putinism and then what happens after Putinism, speculate a bit, and that system was created that way, and this important point that both my colleagues made of the possibility that Putin is trapped by the system he made because he's surrounded by people that became rich, and I know a lot of these people personally, by the way. They can't let him leave because if he leaves, their property rights are not guaranteed. And that, I think, is a real dilemma, but also suggests that it's more than just him. It started with him, and it was his strategy to create the system that he built, the autocratic system that he built, but now he's captive to it. Let's come back to that later. But your question, and again, I mean, the book is 500 pages. There's lots of nuance. Tonight I was trying I want to provoke and give you a clear thesis. Of course, there's not one right and wrong, and this debate between structures and agents is a false one. It's a mix, and under what conditions. So my political science background, I have to say that as a preamble. Okay. Having said that, here's my problem with these kind of deterministic theories about empires. It's because, 300 years ago, if we were arguing about it, there were a lot of empires in the world, and we would have said the same thing about them all. And that turns out not to be true. It wasn't natural course of history that the British Empire would expand forever, or the French Empire, or the Portuguese Empire, right? It turned out there was a finite period to that. Number two, because it's related in Steve's argument and others, likewise, all those places were dictatorships, right? But to say because you're a dictatorship today, you're going to be a dictatorship forever, well, we know that in some parts of the world, in fact, by now, most parts of the world, that argument doesn't apply. There are some rare exceptions, and sitting in Philadelphia, I'm very cognizant. We're one of them that we didn't begin as a monarchy or as an autocracy, but most democracies in the world did. So to say that you're going to be an autocracy 30 years from now because you are today, there's a lot of empirical data over hundreds of years that show that something happens over the course of time, right? And then related to that, just because we're on it, just the cultural piece too that usually comes up in these conversations that, the Russians, they love the strong man and it's part of their history and culture. And there's aspects to that, and there's a lot of important academic work that is done to study that. But I would just remind you all that we've had those theories before about other autocracies, and they kind of look a little silly today. There was a time when my grandfather wouldn't go bowling with Germans because they were Nazis, right? He ended up later marrying one, by the way. This is in Wisconsin. But we had grandiose theories about German culture and Japanese culture and their autocratic ways. Those look kind of silly today. I'm thinking about it being here, and I'm not going to name him because I want to make sure it's right, but I'm pretty sure he was a Stanford guy. 40 years ago, there was a pretty popular theory in these theories about democracy and development that said that Catholics love the strong man because of the Pope. I'm a sometimes Catholic, recovering Catholic. Some weeks I'm Catholic, some weeks I'm not. If Notre Dame wins, I'm going to be Catholic that day. And the reason that theory was developed was because at the time, most predominantly Catholic countries in the world, in Latin America and Southern Europe, were run by dictatorships. Well, that theory looks kind of silly today. And I don't want to say that I can predict the future about either Muslim societies or Orthodox societies. I'm not brave enough to do that. But I do want to suggest that if you look at other cultures, they're more malleable, especially if you take a longer sweep of history. Maybe not in the short run, but in the long run they are.
Authoritarian regimes are stable until they're not. This is a common trope, but I think it's absolutely true. I think the historical argument, to go back to this for a second, if I may, obviously if you can make the same argument about the end of history, which you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, right? That just because we're on this trend for decades, it means it will be this path-dependent inevitability of convergence. And obviously that's not where we are today. The world, right, is in flux, and we're not really sure what's going to come next. But I think my concern is that the trends now seem to be favoring the autocrats and the authoritarians, which of course then, supports the entire system that we're seeing developed in Russia under Putin, but also in other places like China. So that's, yes, authoritarian regimes are stable until they're not, but the trends now, doesn't mean they're inevitable, seem to be encouraging that kind of development across the world. And so my concern is that given that we're doing a lot of navel gazing in the West, we're facing our own internal challenges, challenges to democratic governance, that we're not as prepared as we were during the Cold War to be able to counter, resist, and build resilience to these trends.
I guess I'd like to say, and Mike makes this point in his book, that the individuals are really important, that Russia could have turned out very differently, that Gorbachev was an amazing historical figure, and that Yeltsin himself could have made a different choice at the end of 1999 or in 1999. Right. And so things could have turned out very differently, and I don't think we have to look too far ourselves right now than to know how important the individual is who occupies the White House. So I do think that in this case we need to focus on not focus on structural issues, but realize the importance of individuals and the possibility of change, and as many of my students back there know, that, you can't tell when authoritarian regimes are weak often. They hide it very well, as you said, until they collapse, right? Or until there's an uprising.
Right.
And then whether they transform, that's the interesting question, whether and how.
So let's talk for a minute about why the relationship with Russia is as important as many people believe it is, or maybe it's not. You made the comparison of we're not worried about Moldova, but we have to worry about Russia. Yet the Russian economy is about the size of Spain, somewhere between Spain and Portugal. None of us in this room are worried about Spain and Portugal trying to take over the world. But we do worry about Russia. There's an outsized importance to Russia. Is it just the nuclear weapons? Or is it something else, something more important? And regardless of what it is that makes it have this importance, isn't it the reality that the United States, together with Europe, together with Japan, that economic complex of allies is so much greater than Russia that we shouldn't have to worry about it? Anybody, please.
So this is the great paradox of Russia. How can it be once a declining power, yet a great power? And it is both of those things. It is a declining power if you look at its economic projected growth. The Russian economy is really dependent on hydrocarbon exports. This hasn't changed since the Soviet days. And it's not projected to grow, it's basically projected to stagnate for a while. Demographic crisis, the Russian population is dying out. I think this year is the first time that the official statistics actually reported that migration is no longer outweighing the declining fertility and birth rates. So it very much looks like a country on the decline in many ways. It doesn't have a lot of soft power influence. If you think, it doesn't have a lot of allies. It's very isolated globally. Yet it is a global power that continues to challenge Western national security and foreign policy interests around the world. And it's not just because of its nuclear arsenal, although certainly that military piece to back up its power projection other ways is important, but I also think it's because Putin himself has been very savvy at calculating risk. There's a big debate happening whether he's a strategist or a tactician. I don't think that's a relevant conversation to have, but what I think is very clear is that he's been very good at understanding that where the U.S., specifically the U.S., retreats, that's an opportunity for Russia to exert its influence with very limited resources. And so I think that's why it's a conundrum. It's not like China, which is rising in all ways. It's a power that is both on the decline and continues to be a global power in many ways. And I do think that the national security strategy that this administration published last year had it right, that Russia is an adversary and is a competitor to the United States despite having this relatively small economy, because it's able to assert and play its limited capacities in a very influential way.
I would just add to that a couple of things. Number one, across the board, the power, depending on which metrics you use, declining power or stabilizing power as other rise. There are certain dimensions, however, where they are making real investments and modernizing. Their conventional capabilities today are radically superior to where they were 20 years ago. I think a lot of people aren't paying attention to this. God forbid would there ever be a conventional conflict in that part of the world. The assumption that we're going to repel them easily is incorrect. In fact, my new colleague, former Trump administration official, right before he joined the government, his name's H.R. McMaster, was doing a giant study precisely on this, and he's returning to it now as a Hoover Fellow. He just joined us a month ago. And I think, so on certain dimensions, cyber, the same thing. There's 2 or 3 countries that have real capacity. Russia's in that category, though, because Putin invests in it. And because it's an autocracy, he can overinvest in those kinds of things. Intelligence services, they've invested way more than we have. So they have those capabilities. So that's one thing. The other thing I would just say, it's about the cards he's holding, but he's also willing to play them. So he's holding, a bunch of deuces and 3s and 4s, but he's not afraid to play them. And he's doing things, audacious things that nobody would have dreamed a Russian leader would do just 10 years ago. I mean, like I said in my talk, annexation, like we thought that was extinct. And he did it, and then he feels like he got away with it. What he did in Syria, the longest chapter in my book is about Syria because it's so tragic in my view, and I think it was the greatest mistake of our administration. But he was willing to go in when we didn't think he was going to go in as big as he did, and he did it. And then 2016, they weren't trying to hide it, like as former FBI Director Comey said in his testimony about it. They loved, it was pretty easy to find, and they dared us to do something about it. And even just what happened near the Kerch Strait a few days ago. Like they did that, and he's at the G20, and it seems like it's no big deal. So remember, it's about will to use the power that you have in combination with whatever capabilities you have. And right now, I think he has a lot of will. And I just want to echo something Alina said earlier, that you kept saying, well, we all together. But we are not all together. That's part of the problem. If we were all together and we had a united front, I would feel way more confident. The fact that he is peeling off allies and creating a debate about these things in Europe and especially Europe, but other places as well, that makes it problematic in terms of how we respond to him.
So let's turn and talk about the U.S. side of the equation. And I want to talk about what actually constitutes U.S. policy when it comes to Russia. So President Trump announced withdrawal from the IMF treaty, modernization of American nuclear forces based upon a perception of Russian threat. We have put troops, NATO troops, American troops, at the far eastern edge of the alliance, even greater than the American troops, even greater than the NATO commitment made during the Obama administration, supplied lethal aid to the Ukrainians. So you can list a whole series of things that sound like exactly what President Hillary Clinton would have done. And yet, there's a widespread perception that the Trump administration is soft on Russia, favorable to Russia. Which is true?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to guess, and my colleagues will agree with me, that watching what happened this summer in Helsinki and previously in London made many of us sick to our stomachs and really upset about what we were communicating to the Europeans about our commitment to Europe and our relationship with our closest allies and our support for NATO. And just recently, Pompeo, what he said to the EU was really disturbing if you are devoted to maintaining this united democratic front. And I think that's really important that we and I would have said with response to the other question that we really need to be worried about the undermining of liberal democracy throughout Western and Central Europe, and the questioning of America's leadership there, and the looking to Putin and to authoritarianism as a potential way to deal with the problems that different states are facing now. So I think that we have long-standing members of the American government in the diplomatic corps and through the State Department and in the Defense Department that are behind these notions of being tough with Russia and understanding the importance of liberalism. But unfortunately, that isn't coming from the top, and I'm not just meaning the president, but there are concerning policies and statements coming from the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor.
Specifically on this gap that you've described, this disconnect between what the president says or what we believe he wants to have with Russia, which is a closer relationship, and then the actions the administration has actually taken. This gap has been profound and has been widening since the beginning of this administration. Something I've done at Brookings, just to plug it, which is my usual home, my permanent home, is start a policy tracker of not the tweets, But the specific actions like sanctions, state official statements that this administration has taken, and it's been quite significant. You know, I think as you point out in your presentation, there's, you know, tons of sanctions, more than we've ever had before. So this is significant. But I think what is lacking, of course, is a strategic vision of what all of these separate, disparate policy activities are supposed to achieve. So we keep slapping sanctions on Russia. One, I don't think they've acted as a deterrent, because you just have this incident in the Kerch Strait. We have a Russian attack on Ukrainian Navy. And then all we do, not we meaning the West, is publish a lot of statements of deep, moderate concern. And I think what the Russians are very clearly doing, this has been the case since at least 2008, when they invaded Georgia, is to push the envelope a little bit. And then they wait for the response and they recalibrate. And if there is no response, then they know they can push further. And so that's exactly what they're doing now. So I think the problem that I see from a policy perspective is that there's not a whole of government response, which I think we would have probably seen under a different president. There's not a clear vision or strategy for what we're trying to achieve with Russia. Do we see them as a permanent enemy? Do we see them as an occasional partner? Do we think they can become a friend that can be integrated, as was the case at one point in our history, into the international order still? What are we trying to achieve? And nobody has an answer to that except let's, you know, slap more sanctions on the Russians and see if that changes their calculus. It's clearly not, but that gap is part of the problem, because it's the president that needs to articulate that vision, and the president has not articulated that vision. And so all we have is the administration doing these things that, in the end of the day, don't amount to a cohesive, coherent view of what we're trying to do.
I agree. But let me just add the two bits on both of your arguments. So first of all, you know, on balance, I've said this many times, including it annoys my Obama friends and it annoys the Trump people. And I say it on TV. The Trump administration policy towards Russia is pretty good. You articulated it. There's just one problem with it. There's one guy in the Trump administration that disagrees with it, and he happens to be the President of the United States. And he does disagree with it. It's not just kind of in the nuances. He fundamentally disagrees with it. He didn't want to do the sanctions. He lamented it. You know, they put in, you know, you mentioned lethal assistance during the convention. They put in a new plank to get rid of that. And he has this obsession, and maybe we should, you know, talk about why he might have that obsession, but that he wants to befriend Putin. He does. And he cuts I don't know of a single person, I don't know everybody in this administration, but I know several of them. I don't know anybody that agrees with him with that passion. So that's the one piece. But you raise, I think, which I think is a bigger part that does not get a get out of jail free card to everybody else, which is that in their haste to destroy international institutions or to weaken them, to withdraw, they think that that's how separate from the fight with Russia. And, you know, the national security strategy, or, you know, this Hobbesian world, what's dog-eat-dog world, and we're all going to fight each other, and we're just going to duke it out with the Russians and Chinese and take them on. You know, this is my colleague H.R. McMaster. That's his view of the world, and he wrote that, and you know, it's in the national security strategy as well. I think that's wrong. I think that's an incorrect strategy. We're better off with allies than on our own. We're better off with those international institutions than on our own. And I say that especially for Russia, but not only for Russia. So that's a more fundamental debate, I would say, between that's the Trump administration, not just the president. So both of those things are there. So when we withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, that's good for Russia. That's not just about the fight they want to have with Iran. They then get to be on the side of the international community, and we're the ones on the outside, right? Same thing with the Paris, with the climate accord. Same thing, even with the INF. Yes, the Russians have been violating the INF treaty. I worked on that when I was in the government. But is it the right solution to solve that problem for us to withdraw and then have the entire world turn against us, and oh, by the way, then give them a green light to deploy these weapons, when in fact we have no plans to deploy those weapons. So I just think that piece, the whole administration has to be there. But the first thing is weird. I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, if you guys can think of another time, I don't know of another policy era or president where you had such a disconnect between the president and the entire administration. And some of his defenders, including some of my friends, will say, well, it doesn't really matter what he says, right? The tweets, they don't matter. We're running the show. Everything's fine. Well, you mentioned Helsinki. Guess what? When the president said it was a really good idea to hand McFaul over, suddenly it felt like those words mattered. And I'll tell you this story because you mentioned it. Yep. I work for NBC News. For some of you, I know some of you watch. Thank you. For others, tune in from time to time. And so we were there covering the summit, and I was there with Lester Holt. He's a very important figure in our world, and so we're on live TV, getting ready to cover the press coverage. And oh, by the way, are we on the record, just so I know?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be a little more careful then. I don't want to throw Lester under the bus, but he just very, he's incredibly gracious the way he talks, and he talks like that in real life too, by the way. And he said, just realize, Mike, that the headline, you're the one in charge to driving the headline here. We just report the news. You're the analyst here. And that's when I realized, okay, I better take notes. And actually, Trump made it easy because he agreed with Putin instead of our intelligence community about what happened in 2016. So that was a headline that was easy. But right in the middle of that is when Putin said, I got an idea here. Your Mr. Mueller has indicted 13 Russian government officials. So I have an idea. We have a dozen Americans that we think broke Russian law. At the time, by the way, I did not know I was on the list. I'll tell you the punchline in a minute. And so he said, and he referred to this MLAT treaty, something I knew what it was, that we have this way to, we'll interview your guys, you'll interview our guys. And the president said, this is a really great idea. And you can check it, on national television, I gave the president a pass. I said, it's a mulligan. Like, he didn't know what he was talking about. I did say, by the way, that's why he should have some experts with him when he's sitting with Putin. But he doesn't know what he's talking about here. Surely they'll get this back in place, and this will pass. But on Monday, at the press briefing at the White House, his press spokesperson reiterated, doubled down on that and said it was a very generous offer from Putin, and we're looking into it. And that's when I got nervous. That's when I hired a lawyer. Stanford hired me a lawyer, thank goodness. Very expensive, important, great people. Because all of a sudden, there was a period of days there where actually the president's words were driving the policy. And that day, the press spokesperson over at the State Department, the talking points were great there. She'd said, this is crazy. We think this is nuts. And by the way, on the list were 12 people, not just me, Democrats and Republicans. But she added this phrase, which I'll never forget. She said, while I can't speak for the White House, I'm paraphrasing for the TV, I want to be clear, but you can look it up. While I can't speak for the White House, this is what we're saying over here. And that's absurd. We can't have them on two different places. And that was the first time I had been back to several buildings with my lawyers, including where I used to work at the White House and Justice and the State Department. And, we eventually got it in a good place. By the way, 98 senators voted to help us get it in a good place, so that helped. But that's when I felt this tension between lower level officials, but the president said what he did, so they had to balance that. And just remember, when people say, oh, it doesn't matter what the president says, actually it can matter under certain circumstances, including even for his own government officials that are trying to wade between what they think is the right policy and what the president said. Sorry for the long digression there, but.
Well, you've made the segue perfectly, because before we turn to questions from the audience, I want to move from the bear in the woods to the elephant in the room. So I think the elephant in the room is what you've alluded to, and that is there is a large group of Americans who have come to a conclusion, based on what they've heard so far, that the President of the United States is somewhere between an unwitting tool of the Kremlin, up to, in the case of some folks, the belief that he is somehow actively an agent of the Kremlin. I want to ask the three of you, we all know that there's a lot of information that's not public, but you've heard a lot. You've been hearing it. We've all been hearing it for 2 years. I want to ask each of the three of you your personal assessment based on the evidence that is public at this time of whether or not there's any credence to this notion that the president is somehow compromised by the Russian government.
That is the elephant in the room. Well, obviously, I don't think any of us have access to the documents that the special counsel investigation is looking into. I think based on what I've seen so far, my interpretation is that it's too simple to think that we have a Manchurian candidate in the White House. I do not believe that to be true. I don't see clear evidence for what you could call quid pro quo collusion. However, that's still a possibility that may come out sooner or later. I don't know. What I see is someone who was a businessman that probably had some very shady financial dealings in the real estate business for a very long time. Point in fact, many of the people that worked with President Trump in the past are now convicted felons. So we should keep that in mind. Clearly, he associated people who were not too keen on following the law and the rules, and probably did some shady things. So that's one point, no question about that. And I think if the Mueller probe is digging into his finances, something will come out. And then he very clearly, I think, what happened when he decided to run for president was they didn't expect to win. I think they expected. And this has come out in many of the books that have come out on the Trump administration and the Russia connection. I think they expected this would be a great publicity stunt. And then, after that, Trump would get his Trump Tower in Russia. Maybe he could get Trump Television Network. And this would be a great boon for business. And, of course, then they win, and the whole thing blows up. And they have no idea that anything they've done was even illegal. They weren't thinking about that. I don't think they were thinking about it. So I think there's a lot of incompetence and ignorance that's easy to interpret in conspiratorial terms that I don't necessarily think were there. That's not saying that their laws weren't broken, that there weren't illegal activities of some nature, but this bigger narrative of quid pro quo, I give you this, we mess around in the elections, kind of stuff. I haven't seen convincing yet coherent evidence for that. There's little pieces here and there, but coherently, I don't see the argument that Trump is a cultivated Russian intelligence asset and that he is deeply, deeply compromised for various reasons. Again, that we could learn something new.
Well, I guess I would say I agree with you, Alina, and I want to just talk though about the fact that what worries me is that Trump thinks that foreign affairs and running the government is like running a family business, and he does not understand the way states would or should negotiate with one another, and that you can't always get your way, that most of the time negotiations and diplomacy require some level of compromise. And that's highly problematic in today's world where power really can't determine everything. So I just think that it's his worldview, this idea of America first, as if we really could have only America, and as if we really could always get our way and not undermine other goals and values that we have, is just simplistic and problematic, and that's causing most of his problems and our problems.
So I think I basically agree, but let me add some granularity, a couple of anecdotes from my book about how Putin operates, right? So you talked about how Trump, you both talked about Trump. Let me talk about Putin. I know Putin better than I know Trump. actually. We actually met the spring of 1991. So we're not exactly Facebook friends. Although, given what goes on Facebook, maybe we are, you know. That Anatoly who's always trolling me, that's probably Putin, you know, every night. Anyway. So here's a couple of things I know. First on the salacious part and then on the money part. So as you all know, now President Trump stayed at the Ritz-Carlton in 2013. I was ambassador at the time. We, by the way, made a decision on that delegation not to engage with them. Usually, as an ambassador, you would meet with a prominent business guy like that. And by the way, that was one of the fantastic things about being ambassador, is getting to meet so many dimensions of Russian society, but also American society. Like, my job was to, you know, meet with CEOs and host them, but also like Herbie Hancock, you know. It was my job to have 500 of my closest friends in Russia come to a private concert with Herbie Hancock at my house. That's pretty cool. Or host the NBA, because I have 2 sons. They love basketball. It was our job to host, you know, a bunch of all-stars, and so those are great things. We decided that Miss Universe was probably not a good thing we should associate with. There were some people in the embassy disappointed in that decision. But anyway, I've stayed at the Ritz-Carlton too. I've stayed there several times with the president, with Secretary Clinton, with Vice President. But when we stayed there with Obama, I showed you a photo from that trip, 2009. In order for us to have a private conversation with the president, we built a submarine-like structure with every single piece shipped from the United States of America through diplomatic pouch at incredible expense to you all. So thank you for paying your taxes, if you do. And it was disconnected, and it didn't vibrate, it didn't use their power. That's the lengths we went to have a secure conversation in the Ritz-Carlton. Yeah, wow. Another little story, because you like that story, I could tell. Let me tell you another one about what happens in Russia. Russia is one of the most surveilled countries in the world right now, because Putin's invested in it. He gathers compromise as part of the way that he rules. The first day I was in the office, my wife came over, my kids came over, and we had my briefings, but then we had our family briefings. And at one point, and it's on my mind because he just emailed me today, our regional security officer, the RSO, the guy who's in charge of your security as ambassador, he took me and my wife, Donna's her name, and he said, we need to go to a special place to have this conversation. And we went through these series of doors, like if you ever seen Get Smart, you know, you have to go like through 5 or 6 different doors. Well, you had to do that to get to this room. Because it's a secure room, not unlike the submarine I described. And Andy then said, very diplomatically, he said, you know, if you guys need to have a domestic conversation, this is the room we want you to do it in. And my wife's like, what's a domestic conversation? And an argument, you know? And he said that because he did not want the Russians taping us having a marital dispute. By the way, we never had to use a room, just so you know. But we had to live our lives in this beautiful mansion, Spaso House, fantastic. But, you know, every email, every phone call, every movement we made, we had to assume were recorded. Spaso House is this great place, downtown Moscow, one of the most expensive cities in the world. And it's surrounded by office buildings. And maybe it's changed by now. I haven't been there for a while because I can't go there. But when we lived there, there were 4 rent signs in all of them and 4 sale signs, and nobody ever moved in because they could look down and see us. So what happens in the Ritz-Carlton does not stay in the Ritz-Carlton, okay? That's the first thing. I don't know what he did, but whatever he did, they have. But the second thing is more important, and we kind of alluded to it in the structure of how Putin rules. Putin uses money to leverage people all the time. That's the way he keeps power. Can I do one more anecdote? Okay. He gives money, he lends money, and then you owe him, right? And I remember one day when I saw it up close and personal. I was in an office of a very prominent Russian official, and Putin called. And, you know, I thought it was right, you know, appropriate for me to leave so he could have his private conversation. But this guy wanted to show up. He wanted to show that he was close to Putin. And for the Russian speakers in the room, they were on T. They were using T, not V. And he wanted me to hear that. That was a little signal about his power. And then they got into the conversation, and Putin had just put out a new decree saying all Russian government officials had to divest their assets abroad. And this guy had a lot of assets abroad. And now I'm going to paraphrase because we're on the record, but over the course of this conversation, what was going on was Putin was saying, well, yeah, but for my friends, you don't have to do it. But what happens there, and we now know this, that there are lots of Russian government people that didn't divest, that have their houses all over the place, but they were completely beholden to Putin because of those little things. So that's the way he rolls. That's an anecdote of a way, and then he rolls in a big way when, with Igor Sechin, he gives them the most, you know, the largest oil company in the country, but the only way he has those property rights is that because he's beholden to Putin, right? So I don't know what he did with the Trump Organization in 2008, but I would not be surprised if they looked at that as an opportunity to create leverage. But to know the answer, of course, we have to wait for Mr. Mueller to solve those questions for us.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes. We have got some wonderful questions from the audience. I'm going to ask for short responses, if possible, even though they're complicated questions. Please address the issue of Edward Snowden. Will he live the rest of his life in Russia, and should he? Anybody?
Well, I can tell you about Edward Snowden. That guy really ruined my summer. He showed up in Moscow in the summer of 2013. I shouldn't joke about it. In two ways, he ruined a lot of people's lives, in my view. But he very concretely, we were planning a summit for September 2013, and he showed up. And we basically said to the Russians, if you give them asylum, we're not going to come to your summit. And they gave him asylum, and they dared us. It was one of these Putin dares. It was a similar thing I was talking about, because they didn't think we would do that. And it was my job to go tell Putin's national security advisor, his name's Ushakov, that the president's not coming. And he didn't believe me. He said, well, we've been told by higher people in the government. I'm reminded of this conversation. I'm not going to say who that was. That if we, you know, we might still be able to work this out. And I said, Yuri, he's not coming. So we had worked for a year to prep for that summit and ruined it. The other reason he ruined my summer is that every night at 2 a.m. We had a deputies committee meeting in the U.S. government. So, chaired out of the White House. So 6 p.m. for people in Washington, and I had to traipse over to the embassy every night for about 6 weeks at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and just sit there. And this is the way Obama, we were deliberative, for better or for worse, but we were a deliberative administration. And we go around the room, and, you know, sometimes it was Lisa Monaco, sometimes it was Susan Rice chairing the meeting. And they go around the room, is there anything we can do to get him back? And there was never anything we could do. By the way, Bob Mueller was on a lot of those calls because he was the main interlocutor with the Russians at the time on our behalf, and we failed with him. My guess is he'll be there for a long, long time.
Okay. What's the role of Putin's personal greed in the way he runs Russia and in U.S.-Russian relations?
Personal greed?
Personal greed.
Well, I think it's difficult to say. I mean, we know, or we suspect, that he's one of the wealthiest men in the world. Nobody really knows how much money he has. But I think somebody like Putin, given his personal background, as somebody that grew up, you know, with nothing in the Soviet Union, then everything he had was given to him by the Soviet state. And then he completely, this is important, completely missed the entire opening of his own country, because he, remember, was stationed in Germany at the time, and all he saw was the collapse. And then he comes back to Russia, no longer the Soviet Union, and everything's a chaos, everything is a mess. And then he, works his way up to the top of the Russian government in this really unexpected way. Most Russians will tell you, when Putin was named as a successor to Yeltsin by Yeltsin, that they thought, oh, well, it'll be Putin for 2 months, there'll be, someone else in 6 months. Nobody expected him to last, right? Because this was the nature of Russian politics at the time. But, now that he's there, I think he understands that, one, he has complete access. Two, this is kind of the way the mafia works. The Godfather has to make sure his capos are beholden to him. He has to be the guarantor of their own assets, but he also has to make it very clear that he has more. So is it personal greed? Is it because the system kind of demands that he is this person? Probably a combination of both. But there's no doubt this is a sore point for the regime, and you will see that even people like Alexei Navalny, who's this anti-corruption crusader, has never touched Putin. Because if you touch Putin, you probably will die in some strange incident or accident. Or, they may just shoot you on the steps of the Kremlin, which is what they did with Boris Nemtsov in 2015. So is it greed? Is it the system? It's probably a combination.
Next question we have is, what is the current situation for Alexei Navalny in Russia? Anybody?
Sure. I mean, I know Mr. Navalny. I never met with Alexei Navalny when I was ambassador. I just want to remind you of that, just all that propaganda about me. And it was for reasons it was not good for him to meet with me. And we actually met at one gala for the Moscow Times. I remember the 20th anniversary. And he walked in and he came over and said hello, and the cameras went wild. But I just want to make clear, he's never been on the payroll. He had a very smart strategy vis-a-vis us, I think. I mean, I admire the guy. I don't know, there's controversial in Washington about his politics. He's decided that corruption is the thing to focus on. His brother just got out of jail. He goes in and out of jail, and yet, beneath the scene, beneath the system, there's increasingly younger people are joining, and there's something going on there. I would just say that. I don't know. We're political scientists. We're really bad at predicting regime change. By the way, so is the CIA. We're all bad together, so I would never say that. But I do think there will be a drama after Putin, and I suspect Navalny or somebody like him will be part of it. I don't know where it'll go, but I think there will be quite a bit of drama. And just the anecdote about Putin and money, there were always two numbers that Obama always had in his briefings about Putin. One was how much he was worth, and two, what was his popularity. And those numbers were always bigger for Putin than they were for Obama. But, we used to talk a lot about this, and there were two things. One, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't. I want to get to more of your cards.
Okay.
All right. I will if you want me to answer about it. I feel I'm going on too long, so.
Quick.
Well, all right. The quick thing is the numbers, the popularity number would drive him nuts. He's at, what is he, 60 or something right now, after a peak at 80. And when we were dealing with him, he was hovering in the 60s. And Obama's a very competitive guy. And he would look at that number and he'd say, 60? If I controlled all the television stations and I controlled the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress and all business, I would be at 90. What's the big deal about 60? And the other thing on the money, we were touring around the Kremlin one day, and he was like, the Kremlin presidential offices are way nicer than the West Wing, right? And he was lamenting, man, I got this little Oval Office. Look at these rooms they have. And I reminded the president, yeah, but they had a revolution. And I think about, as Putin builds all of his mansions all over the place, just remember that about that history that they have that we don't.
Okay,
sorry to go on. Yeah.
No, last question from one of our audience members. What is stopping Russia from taking Estonia? The Russian military could invade and occupy Estonia very quickly, and it would be a fait accompli. So let me extrapolate from that. Is it, in your view, a realistic danger that there will be military conflict in Europe with Russia?
NATO. That's all I have to say.
That's right. I mean, this is why the commitment to Western institutions is so important. NATO is the difference. Estonia is a member, and we have to keep our commitment to NATO really strong so that he won't move into Estonia or any place else that's a NATO member.
So I want to end with a little more negative. If we agreed all night long, we have to disagree just a little bit. Here's my nightmare scenario, and I agree. Will Russian tanks roll to Tallinn? I'm not worried about that. The former president of Estonia, by the way, works at my institute at Stanford right now. We debate this all the time. That's not my concern. Here's my nightmare scenario. That some Estonians, ethnic Estonians, show up to Narva, which is very Russian, it's all Russian city, I think. And they get drunk, and they get in a fight. And that's not too hard to imagine, actually, now that I think about it, because it happened to me. I was in Tallinn in 1985, and some drunk Russian took a swipe at me. You can imagine. That's what young men do from time to time, right? Maybe not in Philadelphia, but they do it in other parts. They do that in other parts of the world, okay? So imagine that happens and somebody gets killed accidentally, an ethnic Russian. And then Putin, because he's daring us, he like sends in a bunch of special forces, and he kills 3 Estonians, and he goes home. Then what happens? Go to war over that? Do the Italians go to war over that? Do the Germans? And then I'm a little worried about Article 5, and I know what the Estonians will say about that. That worries me. And here's one more thing that worries me a lot. The Balkans. I'm not going to put you, I did too much testing as a professor today. I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, but public opinion polls shows very clearly most Americans cannot name the countries that are in the NATO alliance that are in the Balkans. We don't know who they are. The vast majority of us do not know who they are. So, especially the new ones, by the way. And maybe even our president isn't even all clear on, there was a meeting he had evidently with the Baltics, and anyway, he got it kind of mixed up. It's confusing. Balkans, Baltics, it's confusing. But what happens if there's another coup? Or some military thing, some intelligence things where the Russians are involved, and it's in a NATO ally in the Balkans that most people don't even know where it is. That's what I worry about, and that's why, just to echo your point, to avoid that, we've got to be, doubling down and tripling down that Article 5 is real, so that Putin is not tempted. And here, I'm with Ronald Reagan, peace through strength. We want to reduce the probability that he would even dream of doing either of those 2 scenarios. And we've got some work to do on that, in my view.
We could obviously go on all night, but we can't. So I want to thank our guests and thank all of you.
Thank you.